Hey guys, video time at the studio, so grab your popcorn and come on in, sit on down, and make yourself comfortable. And let's talk about instruments for your project, studio, home studio. We're continuing on with the ultimate home recording studio guide, and I'd like to talk about whether it's really worth it to have specific instruments in your studio. And I'm talking about everything like drums, bass, guitars, keyboards. And let's go ahead and just kind of narrow a couple of things down and talk about them individually. Now, first off, I do want to say that I think a lot of these requirements for having instruments, it really varies on the type of studio and the size of the studio. And I think things have also changed over the years. For instance, I think it was important years ago to have a good piano in the studio. And I think a lot of the larger studios that can afford them and have the space for a good grand piano, that it's nice to have because obviously you're not going to be easily moving a piano around. But I think with the software emulations in your computer nowadays, you can get some great piano sounds, and I think especially in a mix, they can be just fine. I think the people that are the purists and are recording solo piano type recordings, real piano mic'd up properly may or may not still be the best vote, but I think you get the idea of what I'm talking about in the piano. Obviously, you're not going to be lugging a piano around to a project studio or a home studio. And if you got one in your house, that's great. But as far as supplying one, I don't really think that's necessary, especially with the software. Now, I kind of put drum kits a little bit down the line with them, and I think if you record drums in your home studio, I think that can be a plus. And having a kit already set up, a lot of studios do have drums, mainly to save on the setup time, or they've got a set that they know that sounds good, that's already pre-mic'd. And like I say, the drum kit usually is probably one of the instruments that takes the most time to set up, so that saves on that scenario there. So if you've got a drum set, or you're a drummer, obviously you're going to have a kit. I think that's a good idea if you have the space. However, again, that said, I think some of the software is incredible. I've got Addictive Drums 2, and I've got TuneTrack Superior, and even their Easy Drummer 2. Those products are fantastic, and I think in a mix, I think they work great. And they're very easy to work with, and you know that the sounds right out of the box are going to work great. Now, let's talk more about some other things like smaller keyboards and synthesizers and such like that. And I think if you're an owner of those and you already have them, fine. But if you think that you need to go out and buy one to have in your studio for your customers coming in, I would take a long, hard thought about that, and I probably would skip my money. In fact, I would probably be more interested in buying the software emulations and getting a good bread and butter keyboard software emulation, and have that in your computer. And that way you can do the things like the strings and that sort of thing and the pads. And I think that will be more useful in the long run rather than just buying a hardware version of a keyboard. Also, if you got keyboardists that are coming to your studio, most likely they've already got their favorite keyboard that they like to use, and they're going to probably know it better than you will, unless you're intimate with all keyboards on the planet. But so I would probably skip the keyboard. One thing that I see in a lot of studios is guitars, and quite frankly, I think I see them in the studios that really don't need them, and the studios that are struggling or just starting up. And we had a local studio here, bought some great equipment and a great studio, and then they went out and bought a bunch of guitars thinking that's what they really need to outfit their studio. And I think that was a big mistake. I don't think there's any purpose in buying mid-range guitars and now these guitars can be great, but I'm talking about, say, the Mexican version of the Fenders, the Strats, and the Tellys, or just various guitars along that line. Maybe even a studio Les Paul versus more of a Les Paul Deluxe or something like that. I find, and I'm a guitar player, I find that the guitarists coming to your studio, they're going to bring their own gear. They're going to bring their own axes. So I wouldn't even waste my money on buying guitars for your studio. The guitar players, they're going to bring their own guitars, and I think that applies to the acoustic guitars as well. Now, if you have a couple of specialty guitars, I think that might be an exception. Say you might have a Rickenbacker 12 string, or an acoustic guitar that you might have tuned set for a Nashville tuning, or something along those lines. But as far as just going out and buying an American Stratocaster, I think the individual guitar player, when you get to a certain level, they're going to want the guitar set up and comfortable in their own hands, and they're not going to ask the studio, hey, can I use your Stratocaster? A bass guitar is sort of in the same category, and I might think that you might save your money not outfitting your studio with a bass guitar, unless obviously you already have one in your collection. If you were to get one, I would go ahead and maybe, and this is my personal opinion again, I might just get a Mexican Fender bass, jazz bass, or precision bass, or something like that. And I think you'll find that groups, smaller groups or new groups, that they might find that to be useful. But as far as going out and getting a Rickenbacker bass, or a really high-end fretless bass, or whatever, I'm not a bass player, so I'm trying to whip off, a limbic bass, or whatever, trying to whip off some of these brand names of basses I'm not that good at. But I would go ahead and probably just pass over that. Now, one thing that I do think can be helpful, and again, you have the software to cover this too, but I think if you have percussion instruments like congas and bongos and shakers and triangles and maracas and that sort of thing, those can become useful, because I think a lot of times a group will come in and they just want something to dress up their tracks, and they know that maybe you've got some maracas or the little egg shakers that you can get for $1 a piece or whatever, and they'll have fun putting those tracks on, and a lot of times those tracks really add. And again, if you have some specialty type instruments along those lines, like I say, I mentioned the 12 string guitars, I think those kind of fall into an exception, that if you've got those, that's fine. Let me just cover one more aspect, and I'll let you guys get out of here, and that would be the amplifiers, guitar amplifiers. I think most people recording, and I'm using this generally, when they're recording bass, are just going to go direct in. So I would just go have a good direct box, and then you can use your amp simulation or software in your computer. In fact, I had a video on reamping, which I'm not really that huge fan of, but you might go ahead and just get a nice clean signal for your bass in, and then you can go ahead and reamp that with the software. But as far as having a bass amp, first of all, they're going to be too unwieldy in most situations, or if you've got a big Ampeg SVT type bass amp, you're going to need some isolation, or you're going to have to record that track by itself. Guitar amps, some of these studios that I've mentioned that went out and just bought a bunch of mid-range guitars, and the same thing with the guitar amps. I don't think there's really any necessary need to have that in your studio. If you're a guitarist like me, you probably already have a couple of amps, so that's fine. But to go ahead and try to get different flavors of guitar amps, getting a twin reverb and having a Marshall head and having an orange head and things like that, I think you're just really spinning your wheels, because again, the guitarists coming in are going to bring their own setup, and a lot of them may not even use that. The one exception I might think of is if you have something like an Axe FX or a Kemper Profiler amp, which are hardware versions, but in a way they're basically just amp simulators and they have a lot of effects built in. If you've got the extra cash laying around and want to blow $2,000 or more on one of those, that would be great. But I would save your money for other core items in your studio, and I really stress things like the studio monitoring and things like that. But at any rate, that's hopefully answer some questions about whether you should go ahead and open the wallet for some instruments, or what you really think you need. Again, these are my opinions. They're not set in gold. So grab yourself another bag of popcorn on the way out, and we'll catch you in the next video. See you later, guys.